My name is Thomas. I am 32 years old, and I'm just an ordinary man who always chooses rationality. My entire life, I've adhered to the rule: don't go where you don't belong. But if only I had known that one day this principle would be broken, and it would change everything. That evening, I decided to drive to a small forest near my hometown in Maine. My friends had told me about some abandoned cabins there, where miners once lived. They said these cabins held ancient legends. Honestly, I couldn't care less about the legends, but I've always loved photographing such places. I had an old Canon camera that I considered my best companion on such adventures. I arrived late in the evening. The forest seemed endless. There was something off about it. The silence that enveloped the area was too thick, as if it absorbed all sounds. Usually, even in the most remote places, you can hear the rustling of leaves or the chirping of birds. But this time, nothing. I needed to walk about a mile to the first cabin, which I had found marked on an old map. Along the way, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned around every few minutes, but behind me, there was only the dark green corridor of trees. And then I heard it for the first time. A strange sound, something like a faint whisper coming from all sides. My rational mind assured me that it was just the wind moving through the branches. But deep inside, fear had already begun to take root. With each step, it grew stronger and stronger. When I finally reached the cabin, I was somewhat surprised. It didn't look as old as I had imagined. The wooden beams were cracked but not rotten, and the window frames, though lacking glass, stood almost intact. It seemed as if it hadn't been abandoned for long. I took out my flashlight and directed its beam at the door. It was slightly ajar. That I hadn't expected. Who could have been here before me? Still standing on the threshold, I decided to call out. "Is anyone here?" My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. There was no response, just distant echoes. I took a step inside. The floor creaked under my feet, making me freeze for a moment. The interior was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings. Just dust, cobwebs, and a few old newspapers scattered on the floor. One of the newspapers caught my attention. I picked it up and read the headline: "Miners disappear in Whitewood Forest. Locals speak of a curse." The newspaper was dated 1972. I began reading the article. It described how 10 miners working in a now-closed mine nearby had vanished without a trace in this forest. Locals recounted strange events, lights at night, eerie voices, and even mysterious symbols that appeared on the trees. Symbols? I thought. I wonder if they're still here. I set the newspaper aside and started inspecting the cabin walls. On one of them, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. It was a symbol carved directly into the wood. It resembled a triangle with an eye inside, surrounded by strange spiraling patterns. Something about it felt familiar, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. As soon as I ran my fingers across the symbol, the smell in the room changed. It grew heavy, like damp earth and something rotten. I quickly pulled my hand back, and at that moment, I heard a knocking sound. A loud, forceful knock that came from the next room. "Who's there?" I shouted, but my courage was rapidly dwindling. There was no response. Instead, I heard something heavy and rough dragging across the floor. My flashlight started flickering, and I caught sight of a shadow, long, with distorted limbs, gliding through the doorway. I stood frozen, unable to move. My heart was pounding so loudly that I thought it would burst from my chest. The flashlight kept flickering, and in its weak light, I strained to see what it was. "It's just an animal," I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself of something I didn't believe. No, it couldn't be an animal. The shadow was too large, and too strange. I decided to follow the sound. My instincts screamed, "Run!" But the rational part of my brain forced me to move forward. I stepped into the next room, and there, on the wall, I saw another symbol. This one was different, 2 intersecting circles, with something resembling a spiral in between. And then I realized that the noise had stopped. An absolute silence enveloped everything. Instead of fear, I felt something else, cold. It seeped into me, as if it were crawling directly under my skin. I turned around and realized the door I had entered through was now closed. "Who's playing games here?" I shouted, but my voice sounded pitiful. I rushed to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The wood felt ice cold to the touch. And then, behind me, I heard breathing. Slow, steady. It seemed so close. I turned abruptly, shining the flashlight in front of me, and nothing. An empty room, bare walls. But the breathing didn't stop. "Enough! I'm just leaving!" I shouted, and this time my voice echoed in the room with an eerie resonance, as if someone was repeating my words in a whisper. In the darkness, something moved. It was as if a shadow detached itself from the wall and began to advance toward me. I stumbled backward in terror, but my legs hit some invisible obstacle. I fell onto my back, and the flashlight flew out of my hands. The only source of light now was its faint, erratic beam spinning wildly, casting bizarre shadows on the walls. One of those shadows began to separate from the others. It moved on its own, and my mind needed a few seconds to grasp the horrifying realization. The shadow was coming toward me. I felt something cold and sticky touch my hand. It didn't feel like a human hand. No, it was something soft yet impossibly strong. I screamed, desperately trying to break free, and kicked at the unknown entity with my foot. It worked. The thing retreated, and I grabbed the flashlight. The beam of light danced across the room again, but now there was nothing there. Just emptiness. I was breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. But there was no time to think. From the hallway, a new sound echoed, a scraping noise like metal being dragged across wood. "I need to get out of here," I muttered to myself. I rushed to the door, which, to my surprise, now opened effortlessly. But as I stepped through, I realized I wasn't where I had been before. It was the same cabin, but everything looked different. The wood on the walls was rotted, cobwebs hung in thick, heavy sheets, and the stench of decay was nearly unbearable. I took a step forward, and something crunched under my foot. Looking down, I saw a human skull. Surrounding it were scattered bones, coated in what looked like a dark, slimy substance. My mind screamed that this was a dream, but the smell, the cold, and the overwhelming sense of reality left no doubt. I was here, and this was real. And then I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was louder and clearer. The words didn't sound like English, but their meaning was unmistakable. "Stay with us. You are ours." I ran out of the cabin without looking back. The darkness seemed thicker than before. It wrapped around me, pressing in like a living thing. But I kept running, stumbling and breaking through bushes. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized the forest had changed. It wasn't the same path I had taken earlier. Around me stood trees that looked like skeletal fingers, their trunks covered in the same symbols I had seen in the cabin. Some of them emitted a faint greenish glow. Panic began to set in. The forest felt endless, but I couldn't just stay in one place. My mind raced with thoughts about the mine, the newspaper, the missing miners. This place was cursed. I understood that now. But why me? Why did they want me? I kept moving forward until I saw a glimmer in the distance. Light. Hope. Maybe it was the way out. But the closer I got, the clearer it became that this was no exit. It was the mine. The entrance was partially collapsed, but the same green light shone from within. Around the entrance, someone, or something, had carved dozens of symbols. They seemed to pulse, almost as if they were breathing. I didn't want to go in, but any other path seemed to have disappeared. "I'll just take a quick look and leave," I said, more to reassure myself than anything else. I stepped inside. The darkness swallowed me, and the flashlight's beam barely made a difference. But the glow deeper within the mine guided the way. The echo of my footsteps sounded too loud, almost as if it was provoking the mine itself. And then I heard it. A voice. It came from somewhere ahead, deep in the shadows. "You've come. We've been waiting." The voice didn't seem real. as if it hadn't come from human lips. It was both deep and whispery at the same time, reverberating as though it emanated from the very walls of the mine. My heart pounded furiously, but my legs moved on their own. It was as if some force had taken control, compelling me to go deeper. The mine felt endless. The walls were adorned with the same symbols I had seen in the cabin, but now they were larger and seemed to glow from within. Their pulsations synchronized with the rhythm of my heart, creating the terrifying illusion that I was part of this place. I tried to stop, but something held me back. It felt as if the ground beneath my feet had come alive, refusing to let me turn around. I glanced behind me. The entrance had long since disappeared into the darkness. Panic overtook me, and I screamed, "Leave me alone! What do you want?" The voice responded immediately, now terrifyingly close. "You are ours now. You will not return." The flashlight flickered and went out. I was left in complete darkness. Only the green glow of the symbols gave me any sense of my surroundings. I reached out to feel the walls, hoping for some kind of anchor, but my hand brushed against something that made me scream. It was a hand, cold as ice and stiff as though it had been dead for a long time. I jerked my hand back and began stumbling backward until I tripped and fell. And that's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens, no, hundreds, of glowing eyes in the darkness. They were everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, hanging in the air. And they were all staring at me. "Who are you?" I shouted, barely able to hold back sobs. The eyes vanished, but in their place, something far worse appeared. From the shadows, a figure emerged, both human and inhuman. It looked like a miner, a helmet, a ruined face, torn clothing. But its body seemed to be made of tar-like liquid, dripping black drops onto the ground. And from its chest protruded bones, glowing with the same green light. "You are ours!" the creature growled. I felt my body freeze. Strength drained from me, as though this thing was siphoning away my will. It reached out a hand toward me, and I felt something cold and wet brush against my face. In that moment, I remembered the newspaper I had found in the cabin. The curse of the mine. The missing miners. This was them. Something deep within me managed to muster the last reserves of strength. I pulled out the knife I always carried in my pocket and slashed it across the creature's arm. It recoiled, and I realized it could be hurt. Without thinking, I began wildly swinging the knife in front of me, stepping backward. "You won't have me!" I screamed, though I barely believed it myself. Suddenly, my blade struck something solid. It was an old wooden beam, part of the mine's support structure. I knew that if even one of these beams broke, the entire mine could collapse. But I also understood it might be my only chance of escape. Without hesitation, I started hacking at the beam. The knife dulled quickly, but I didn't stop. The creatures were closing in. There were more of them now. They no longer hid in the shadows. They stepped fully into the dim, greenish light. Each was different, but all were equally grotesque. "You won't make it," the voice echoed. I didn't listen. With one final strike, the beam gave way. The mine began to tremble, and shards of wood and chunks of rock started raining down from the darkness. The creatures let out a horrific wail as the entire place began to collapse. I turned and ran, desperately searching for the exit I could no longer see. My heart pounded, my breaths were ragged, and the sound of falling debris mixed with the creatures' cries created a cacophony of terror. All I could do was run, praying that I'd find my way out before everything came crashing down. I don't know how I managed to escape. Everything around me became a blur, the deafening sounds of the collapse, the screams of the creatures, my own frantic heartbeat. But when I burst onto the surface, the light of the moon hit me square in the face. The forest was silent, as if nothing had happened. I turned around. The entrance to the mine was completely sealed. No green glow. No symbols. Just rubble and silence. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it. Something from the mine had escaped with me. I stood in front of the collapsed mine, struggling to steady my breath. The cold night felt unreal, just like everything I had just experienced. My head was buzzing, but one thought wouldn't leave me: this wasn't over. I looked around. The forest seemed different. Denser. Darker. The trees appeared to be leaning toward me, their branches resembling outstretched fingers. Then I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it wasn't coming from inside the mine. It was right here, close by. And it was calling my name. Thomas. Thomas. Leave me alone! I shouted in response, though I knew I was yelling into nothingness. Suddenly, I heard another sound. It wasn't as terrifying, but it still put me on edge: the rumble of a car engine. I ran toward the road where I had parked my truck, hoping it would be my way out. But something felt wrong. Every step became heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to hold me back. When I finally reached the road, I saw my old pickup truck. It was where I had left it. But next to it was another vehicle, an old, rusted truck that looked like it had been submerged in a swamp for decades. Its doors were open, but there was no one inside. Curiosity, or perhaps sheer stupidity, pushed me closer. On the seat there was a flashlight, just like mine, only older. Next to it lay a crumpled newspaper, eerily similar to the one I'd seen in the cabin. Its headline was barely legible: "The Disappearance of Thomas Andrews. Another case in Whitewood Mine." It was impossible. My name. My story. I dropped the newspaper and spun around, sensing something closing in behind me. When I turned, I saw them again. The eyes. But this time, they weren't hiding in the darkness. They were everywhere, between the trees, on the hood of the truck, even hanging in the air. And they were all fixed on me. I leapt into my pickup, started the engine, and floored the gas pedal. But the road ahead seemed endless. The headlights illuminated only a small stretch of the darkness, and the forest on either side felt unnaturally empty yet alive. The whisper grew louder. It was everywhere. "You can't escape, Thomas. You are ours." When I finally reached my house, I thought it was all behind me. My mind desperately tried to find a logical explanation. It's hallucinations. Exhaustion. Panic. But as soon as I stepped over the threshold, I knew it wasn't over. On the living room floor lay shards of a broken mirror. I didn't remember it breaking. In fact, I was certain it had been intact when I left that evening. The fragments reflected something strange. Not me. Not the room. They reflected the mine. That green glow, those symbols. I moved closer and leaned over one of the shards. That's when I saw it, a figure standing directly behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Cold sweat drenched my body. I could hear my own heavy breathing, but nothing else. Everything was silent. Too silent. The phone rang, and I nearly dropped it when I saw the number. It was my own number. Despite every instinct screaming not to, I answered. From the other end came a voice. "You can't escape. You're with us." I threw the phone, and it shattered into pieces. But the voice didn't stop. It was inside my head now. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. I knew I had only one option left. I had to go back. The mine had taken a part of me, but it had left something in return. Something dark, something horrifying. And now, it was with me. I couldn't go on living, knowing that. I got into my pickup truck and drove back to the forest. When I reached the spot where the mine had collapsed, I saw that the entrance was open again. It was as if its forces had been waiting for me. The green glow filled the entire tunnel. I stepped inside, knowing that this time, I wouldn't be coming back. As I stepped back into the mine, everything around me seemed to come alive. The darkness here wasn't just an absence of light. It was a living entity, pulsing, breathing, almost speaking to me. The green glow of the symbols on the walls was now stronger, brighter than before. It felt like they had been waiting for me. I walked deeper, each step feeling heavier. My mind was torn between fear and an eerie calm. A part of me no longer wanted to fight. A part of me had accepted that I belonged to this place now. New markings began to appear on the walls, ones I hadn't seen before. They were drawings, depictions of miners, scenes from their lives, but every image ended the same way. The miners lay dead, and over them stood dark figures, the same ones I had seen earlier. Up ahead, a dull thudding echoed through the tunnel. I froze. It was a sound unmistakable in its origin, the strike of a pickaxe against stone. But how was that possible? This mine had been abandoned for years. "Who's there?" I shouted. There was no answer, but the thudding continued. I moved toward the sound, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The passage narrowed, and it felt like the mine was closing in around me. Finally, I saw the source of the sound. Ahead, in the eerie green glow, stood a man. His figure was half hidden in the shadows, but I could see him raising a pickaxe and striking the wall. Rocks crumbled to the floor. His movements were slow, mechanical, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Hey! Can you hear me?" I yelled. The man stopped and turned toward me. His face resembled that of a miner, but his skin was burned and melted, as if it had been eaten away by acid. His eyes glowed with the same green light, and his mouth stretched into an inhuman grin. "We've been waiting for you, Thomas," he said, his voice distorted, as though it came from underwater. "You are one of us now." I stepped back, but the ground beneath me became soft, as if it were trying to swallow me. The man took a step forward. His hands now looked like monstrous claws, and he reached out toward me. "Why me? What do you want from me?" I screamed. He laughed. It wasn't his laugh alone, it was the laughter of hundreds of voices, echoing in unison. "You woke us. We have always been here. We are the mine. We are the forest. And now you are ours." I ran. I didn't care where, I just wanted to escape. But the mine wouldn't let me go. The ceilings began to lower, and the tunnels narrowed. It felt like the very structure was trying to trap me. Ahead I saw an opening. It was a large chamber, filled with that same green light. In the center of the room was a strange object, a massive black sphere, hovering in the air. It pulsed like a heartbeat. And I knew instantly, this was the source of everything. The heart of the mine. Surrounding the sphere stood the figures. There were many of them. They stared at me but didn't move. Their glowing eyes bored into me, piercing straight into my soul. "You must become one of us," said a voice, emanating from the sphere itself. I realized there was no other choice. I had to stop it. I grabbed a rock and summoned every ounce of courage I had. With all my strength, I hurled it directly at the sphere. The rock struck its mark, and cracks began to spread across the surface of the sphere. Its pulsing intensified, and the figures around it began to howl. The ground beneath me trembled, and the entire mine started to collapse. I turned and ran toward the exit. The symbols on the walls dimmed and went dark one by one. Rubble fell all around me, but I didn't stop. I kept running, desperate to get out. I made it outside at the very last moment. The mine collapsed with a deafening roar, leaving behind only a cloud of dust. The forest looked different now. The trees stood still, their branches no longer resembling claws. The whispering was gone. There was only silence. I sank to the ground, trying to process what had just happened. It seemed like it was over. But when I looked down at my hands, I saw the tips of my fingers were coated in a thin layer of black tar. It began to slowly drip, leaving behind a chilling sensation. That's when I realized, even though the mine was destroyed, I was still a part of it. A few weeks later, I returned to normal life, or as close to normal as was possible. But every now and then, I saw shadows that didn't belong to the real world. I heard whispers when I was alone. And sometimes, waking up in the middle of the night, I saw myself in the mirror. But it wasn't me. It was another Thomas. The one who stayed in the mine.